There are many things that people often forget about. The people talk about the first radical revolution was the Russian Revolution of 1917. But before that, there was another revolution even more radical than the Soviets. There was an anarchist revolution in Mexico almost a full decade before. We are going to talk about the two anarchist civilizations that were founded during the Mexican Revolution, the Morelos commune and the Baja Rebellion. And this is the Mexican Revolution was first started by an anarchist named Ricardo Flores de Mango, who was very important in the history and culture of the Mexican people. And to talk about that, we have to understand their history. The land belongs to those who work for it. Mexico in 1910 was a land where emerging working class was adopting radical forms of organization and struggle, where the indigenous people were still continuing their resistance against 300 years of rule initiated by Spain, where the bourgeoisie itself was attempting to develop and consolidate its power against the established institutions of the old regimes and the Catholic Church. The regime directed by Porfirio Diaz represented the interests of the small group of rich owners and the vast agricultural estate, in addition served the interests of the foreign capital, including that of the United States. It was opposed by various groups with the liberal bourgeoisie who wanted a national revolution to institute bourgeois democracy. This agreement was first led by Madero and Carranza. Carranza represented a group of landowners in the northern Mexico who had been excluded from the regime. In addition, there was a movement around by Mango brothers, which was involving in the increasing anarchist direction of workers' movement to a lesser or greater extent influenced the Magonistas, which later were influenced by the legendary Emiliano Zapata, and later Pancho Villa, and much later the Zapatista Society in Chiapas, Mexico. The aging Diaz, in power for 34 years, announced his impending retirement, which started out the period of unrest. The bourgeois opposition advanced a candidate to the presidency and pushed it through rather than giving to the customary compromise with the regime that was frequent in Mexico. The opposition turned to mobilization of the masses to help this come about. Throughout Mexico, conditions were widely diverse. There were still the free village based on traditional Indian ways of organization, where land was farmed on the collective basis. There were the laborers of the big estate in the timber industry in the jungles who were virtually slaves. There were the cowboys and ranch hands in the north and the small farmers. This connect had been slowly building along before the bid of Madero for power. The free villages were increasingly under threat and the big estates were expanding propelled by the development of mills and the sugarcane industry. Madero was typically a moderate member of the bourgeois, whose aims were solely the departure of Diaz and the introduction of democracy. He now made himself popular with the promise of land reform, having the financial backing of several Mexican and American capitalists, as well as relying on his own personal fortune. The Mango brothers, the foundation of the Liberal Party of Mexico. The movement led by Ricardo Flores de Mango and Jesus Flores de Mango had a much longer record of opposition to Diaz. They have founded a opposing journal called Regeneración in 1900 and soon formed the Partido Liberal Mexicano, or the Mexican Liberal Party, which essentially advanced a program of civil rights. Gradually, under the influence of Ricardo, this party oriented itself toward indigenous free communities and the poor peasants. The Mango brothers were forced into exile in the United States while maintaining contact with the PLM members in Mexico. In exile, Ricardo met American anarchist Emma Goldman and established a friendship with the Spanish Florencio Basora, a friend of the Italian anarchist Enrico Malatesta. Links were formed with the Socialist Party of America and the industrial workers of the world. The PLM, despite continuing to retain the same title, started to transform itself into an anarchist communist organization. The Magonistas began to smuggle regeneration to Mexico, and mass agitation took place among the workers and peasants. The PLM attempted two insurrections in 1906 and 1908, both repressed. For their part, the United States interned some of the PLM leadership in 1907 for conspiracy and violation of the laws of neutrality between Mexico and the United States. When Madero called for an uprising against Diaz on the 20th of November 1911, the PLM mobilized its forces. They were in favor of the tactical alliance on the ground with Madero forces against Diaz, but were categorically against the political alliance with them. Indeed, the PLM hoped to win elements of the Maderistas over the more radical oppositions. Unfortunately, Madero uprising failed. It was only in later December that the movement renewed itself. The PLM forces under Presidente Guerrero crossed the border and marched through the state of Chihuahua. The PLM rose up in 9 other states in Mexico, orchestrating joint military activity with the Maderistas and inflicting big defeat on the old regime in Baja California. The PLM seized Mexicali and this deeply disturbed the regime. The PLM hoped for a long run to exorbitate the big landowners were, in the meantime, forced them to hand over large sums of money. The PLM, in addition, hoped to use Baja California as a base from which supported other PLM units. The PLM units gained many victories, in contrast with the poor military record of Maderista. Internationally, many socialists, syndicalists, and anarchists began supporting the cause of the PLM. Thanks to Silva, the PLM guerrilla commander Madero returned to Mexico from the States, but on the following day declared himself commander-in-chief on the insurgent forces, and after another PLM commander came over to his side, he arrested Silva for refusing to recognize his authority. The situation was compounded by the split between the leadership in the states. Clearly anarchist communists and some members of the PLM membership in Mexico, not as politically developed and leading to compromise with Madero, but his part, Madero denounced PLM militants to both the U.S. and Mexican governments and profited from the lack of communication to battle the myth that the two movements were in alliance. This destroyed the PLM unity, leading to split towards Madero. Madero was 8 leading Magonistas arrested in Chihuahua, and 147 members of their unit were disarmed. At the same time, a campaign of slanders began against the PLM on both sides of the border. On the American side, they were portrayed as mere bandits. On the Mexican side, they were portrayed as tools of the American interests. The situation was facilitated by a large number of American volunteers swelling PLM ranks by the socialists and anarchists of the IWW. Madero finally came to power in November of 1911, signing a treaty with Diaz. Officially, revolution was over, and Jews laid down their arms. The PLM refused, and saw that social revolution was continuing within Mexico. However, many insurgents now through the Madero regime would lead progressively toward greater social justices. The American Socialist Party withdrew its support from the PLM and transferred its Madero. Only a section of the IWW and the anarchists continued to support it. And Emilio Zapata organized armed bands to take back communal lands seized by the state. He represented a new generation willing to fight for the cause. And making a constitution before the Soviet revolution, it was even more radical than the Soviet because it was based on the principles of anarchist communism. And there were true anarchist society in Mexico throughout these times, in different away from the state influence of the bourgeois. Despite these setbacks, a regeneration released a new manifesto to replace that of the 1906, calling for the struggle against authority, the church, and capitalism, and for the establishment of free society. However, some influential members of the PLM, including Jesus Flores Mango, and had rallied to Madero. In June 1912, Ricardo and other PLA militants were arrested by the U.S. government and sentenced for 23 months in jail for breaking the neutrality laws. Peace only lasted a few weeks. After signing a treaty, several members, including of the Zapata, took up cry of land and liberty. Madero himself was murdered by the reactionaries, and a new phase of unrest began, which Ricardo Flores Mango came out of jail in January 1914. He renewed his agitation, criticized the successive regime, and denounced the mass manipulation of the masses by the different factions of the bourgeois. He castigated Pancho Villa for acting as their servant, but praised Zapata for his bravery, maintaining their principles, and behaving as anarchists, while not using the title. However, repression was fading more and more upon the PLM. Ricardo and Librador Rivera were again arrested by the U.S. government and were sentenced respectively 20 and 15 years in prison for their actions. In 1932, Ricardo died in prison with strong indication that he had been murdered by the U.S. authorities. Released in 1923, Rivera returned to Mexico where he was leading a light in an anarchist group, Hermanos Rojos, maintaining his conviction until his death in 1932. In the south, Emiliano Zapata organized armed bands to take back communal lands seized by the state, spurred by Madero's bid to challenge the old regime. He represented a new generation ready to fight, and the village elders accepted the situation, standing aside to let them take over the village council. The movement around Zapata was distinguished by its determination to restore communal land. As a result, it increased from a small band to a large movement. It forced the Madero regime to talk about widespread land reforms. The Zapatistas established a plan of Ayala, calling for the return of seized lands, and further that the third of land owned by the state be redistributed to the landless. They was drafted by the Zapata and local anarchist teacher Oteolio E. Montano. After Huerta represented the old regime, seized power and murdered Madero, many Magonistas and syndicalists fled south and made contact with the Zapatista movement. Among these were Octavio Juan, a French anarchist communist, and the brother Ignacio and Antonio Díaz Soto Gama. Huerta coup meant that the opposition was coming from the liberal bourgeois, the workers' movement, the rural movement. In the north, movement of cowboys and ranch hands around Villa adopted the plan of Ayala, effectively united the movement in the countryside. Huerta was defeated. In the process, the peasant group dismantled many big estates and killed or expelled many officials of the old regime. The Zapatistas fought the classic guerrilla campaign, making sudden appearances and then disappear again. The movement came to conclude tens of thousands. When Huerta was smashed, the Zapatistas controlled the south, and the convention of the Aguascalientes in September 1914, in different forces involved in the smashing of Huerta met up. The peasants and workers for the Revolutionary Union first threw the plan of Ayala. Carranza and his group refused to accept this and set up their own government. These Carrancistas, they began to co-opt insurgent leaders. One of these is a Zapatista leader called Jose Rojas, who had become governor of Durango, joined Carranza, and together they set up a committee of agrarian reform. At the same time, Carranza sought to buy off the workers' movement by promising labor legislation and organizing rights. The Carrancistas smashed Villa in the north, and in the south isolated the Zapatistas. Intelligentsia and many workers' leaders made their peace with Carranza. The Zapatista movement continued in the south, with Zapatista issuing many denunciations of the new regime. But by now, he had lost most of his intellectual supporters. Some of the insurgents would have been won over by promises of non-interference in the Zapatista territory. On April 9, 1919, Zapata was lured into a trap and gunned down. The final phase of the revolution took place when some of the Carranza generals will represent a more radical approach of section of the bourgeois, revolted and the following hostility, finally defeating him. In this conflict, the new contender for power, General Obrego, received the support of many remaining Zapatistas who were earlier joined Carranza. The triumph of Obrego meant to the institutionalization of the revolution reflected in the title of the new ruling party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. The hope and inspiration of workers and peasants has been dashed. What was the revolution defeated? The PLM out the military insurrectional quest before the political education of its militants. As a result, there was a lack of ideological unity, as seen in the secession splits and defections. The 1906 and 1908 insurrection had resulted in the deaths and imprisonment of many of the most active and politically advanced militants. The PLN and its progressive toward anarchists began to insinuate the importance of working class over the peasantry. However, the working class in Mexico was still in development and too weak and numerous small to have decisive influence. For its part, propagation of PLM ideas among the peasants was hindered to a certain extent by widespread illiteracy. Recruitment to the PLM had been difficult, and the influx of foreign volunteers had distorted the situation. The leading light of the PLM had in the main remains in the Angeles and their should have been on the ground in Mexico. They had believed that the production of regeneration and everybody being in the state was of first importance. The removal from the scene clouded their judgment, and their lack of clarity led to the debate of the intellectual level as to whether or not they were truly anarchists. What they were certainly, and they established true anarchist societies throughout the revolution, and maintained an international solidarity. And the PLM suffered from lack of finance, where Madero, for example, was able to call on millions of dollars. To end in positive note, the PLM had numerous influenced the struggle of both workers and peasants with their anti-authoritarian radicalism. Then from Zapatista in the south to the formation of unions heavily influenced of anarchism. Today still in Osaka and Chiapas, the PLM inspired the present-day Magonistas. Also, the Zapatista movement, while mostly effective in its military activity and its occupation, it failed to actively form an alliance with urban workers, only gaining to support a small number of anarchist workers and intellectuals. Like the PLM, its lack of political education led to the defection of people like Ruiza and others, with the first of Villa and Zapata arrived in Mexico City. They failed to take the initiative, they failed to form an effective and lasting alliance from themselves, failed to establish links of solidarity with urban workers, and failed to confront Carranza in the attempt to dismantle state power. Nevertheless, the influence of the Zapatista echoes down to the present day. As the worker movement lack of experience and numerical weakness does not excuse an ability to link up with the agrarian movement, the support given to Carranza against those movements, the revolutionaries both in Mexico and elsewhere need to reflect on all these mistakes and prepare to fight against co-option and compromise in future social struggles. In Baja California, also known as Lower California, is the long finger of land that stretched down to the Pacific south of the border of California and the United States. The border towns of Tijuana and Mexicali and the coastal town of Ensenada are its chief towns. Here for 6 months during 1911, a major insurrection took place and organized. Look at the title No event in which the famous wobbly Joe Hill is rumored to have been involved. On January 29, 1911, 20 armed Marconista militants led by Jose Maria Leya seized the town of Mexicali. Levi called himself the general-in-chief in the insurgent forces and was assisted by Sermon Berjol. This act threatened the rich agricultural state as well as the water resources used by the U.S. farmers of Imperial Valley. The Magonistas were soon joined by many volunteers from the United States, boosting their members to 80. A column of soldiers were sent from Ensenada to drive them out. At the same time, the U.S. press and eccentric businessman Dick Ferris, with backing from important bankers, began to make announcements about creating an independent Baja California and to recruit 1,000 men to carry this out. The U.S. press began to forcibly amalgamate the Magonista action with Ferris' plan. The government troops were defeated and the insurgents increased their numbers to 200. The socialist Johnny Kenneth Turner brought them a delivery of arms over the border. A few days later, 30 Americans led by ex-Sergeant William Stanley seized a border post to the east of Mexicali. The following day, Leya and the veterans declared the foundation of a cooperative commonwealth of Baja California. The insurgents now numbered 300 in Mexicali, with 2/3 of them from the USA. On March 1st, another Margonista column led by Francisco Vallesalina and Luis Rodriguez crossed the border into Baja California and started requisitioning with the biggest state near Tecate. Indecision with the insurgent rank in Mexicali led to serious disagreement, with Stalin attempted to strip Leya of his command, which was countered by Berjol. Stalin then crossed the border into the United States with the aim of convincing the Magonista leadership in Los Angeles that he should lead an independent expedition. Luis Rodriguez seized Tecate on March 12, while Stanley again seized the same border post and built up his forces to 100. Meanwhile, the U.S. government, affrighted by the perceived threat to his interests, massed 20,000 soldiers on the border. Fighting now broke out between the government troops and the insurgents. Tecate was retaken, and Leya and Berjol failed to regain it. An antagonism between Mexicans and Americans with the insurgent rank continued, with Leya being blamed for the defeat. He was dismissed as commander and replaced by Salinas. Disobeying Salinas, Stanley launched an attack on government troops and was defeated, dying a day later. He was replaced by Khalid Abrispris, a Welsh soldier of fortune who accused Salinas of having betrayed Stanley. On 13 April, Petro died of infection of wounded hand sustained for the previous month. The election of the new commander aggravated the conflict between the Mexicans and Americans and the group of Indians led by Emilio Guerrero, while the detachment quit the detachment. Meanwhile, the industrial workers of the world delivered arms of the insurgents. Salida arrived in Los Angeles to meet the Magonista leadership, but was arrested. But the U.S. authorities, Francisco Quijaldas, replaced him. Meanwhile, Mosby was wounded and replaced by Samuel, who was joined by Pierce and retaken down at Tecate. They seized Tijuana. After fierce fighting in Tijuana was, and still is, a playground for America to come over the border to spend their money in saloons, casinos, brothels, racetracks, and other capture to Tijuana to like great enthusiasm with radical soldiers with 30 deserters from the U.S. Army crossing the border to join the insurgents. However, Media attention went to Pierce's head. He set up a system where for 25 cents American tourists would visit the site of battle. He allowed the saloons and gambling dens to continue their activity, taxing them and sending $850 of the Magonista leadership. Pierce became more and more out of control and started talking about uniting Baja California to the United States. In several interviews to U.S. papers, he regularly crossed the border, dining at their best restaurant in San Diego, established contact with the business of Dick Ferris. Madero regime had come to power on the 21st of May. The Magonista leadership refused to cease hostility, and Pierce, who was favorable to a ceasefire, went to LA, argued for this. He was dismissed. He placed at Tijuana was taken by Louis James, also under the influence of Ferris. James called for an independent republic and a new regime, used this as a pretext of accusing the Magonistas of serving the U.S. interests. Fortunately, James was ousted and forced to flee. Mostly attempted to control the situation, closed down the saloon and casinos. However, he still looked for tourist revenue and set up Wild West shows in the style of Buffalo Bill. The Mexican government conveyed by the U.S. authorities, which allowed 1,500 Mexican troops to cross and recross the border and attack the insurgents. The detachment of Guerrero was a massacre. For their part, the U.S. authorities arrested Magonista leadership in Los Angeles. Leia, who had gone over to Madero regime, negotiated a surrender on the insurgents in Mexicali. Leia later made a career in the Mexican army. The forces led mostly by Tijuana refused to surrender and were attacked the government troops. The insurgents disappeared into the countryside, and the Americans fled over the border where they had dismantled by the U.S. Army. The attempt at revolution in Baja California proved to be a fiasco, with the insurgents crippled by dissidents between Americans, Mexicans, and Indians, and with opportunism and a lack of popular principle rife among some of its leading actors. The birth of the worker movement in Mexico was probably influenced by anarchism. This movement proclaimed independence for the political party and the state. Yet in 1915, a pact was signed with the constitutionalists led by Carranza. Organized look at this, this might happen to the workers' movement in Mexico was relatively young in experience. At the time, the population counted 11 million who had lived in the countryside as opposed to 4 million live in the urban centers. A comparison with Russia during the 1917 revolution occurred being made. The first 2 decades of the 20th century was marked by the radicalization of the Mexican workers. While in the Russian Revolution, people talk about the vanguard and Lenin's group doing in reality, they were doing nothing. It was mainly an anarchist revolution, and Lenin's group, in order to keep up with everybody else, they had to make an anarchist approach of organization, a small collection of affinity group based on horizontalism in order to keep out everybody else. They never practiced democratic centralism. They never practiced any of their ideals. They only started to do that after they got in power, after they took the credit from mostly an anarchist-style revolution in Russia. With the influx of Spanish immigrants bringing with the new form of organization, the traditional forms of organization began to give way to a new radical base of the ideas of anarcho-syndicalism. When Madero came to power in 1911, the legislature worker organized that he assisted under the regime of Porfirio Diaz did not disappear. However, the fall of Diaz had encouraged his movement, and strike of transport workers, bakers, cloth makers, and dockery at the port town in Tampico broke out during that year. A Colombian anarchist, Juan Francisco Mosaleano, arrived in Mexico in 1912 with 7 others set up in like group, forming mostly of manual workers. They found a paper of the same name proposed to set it up to a free school modeled the principle of the anarchist teacher Ferrer. The paper was suppressed and Moncaleano was expelled by the Madero regime. However, those remain set up the Casa de Obrero Mundial, or the House of the International Worker, name being also being used for local federation unions. New papers supported by Casa began to appear in 1913. The Casa carried out intense activity, advanced the idea of direct action, and rejected the intervention of Ministry of Labor created by the new leader of Mexico, Huerta, and conflicted between the workers and the employees. However, a section of the movement began to ally itself with another contest for power, General Carranza. The Casa building was closed down by the authorities with planned demonstration on May 1, 1914, being used as a pretext. With the fall of Huerta, Carranza now interfered and allowed Casa to establish itself as a commandeer convert. The Carranza regime inaugurated imperial normalization into the Mexican Revolution, intriguing multiple whole host charismatic and profiteer insert themselves into administration. Norms were established controlling negotiation with the employers, demonstration on the street, political meeting, etc. The state now became the legal arbiter in workplace dispute in this climate. The Casa establishment pact with Carranza on February 17, 1915, and workers organized by the Casa and Rep battalions and Anarchist sanitary battalion reinforced Carranza's troops. They were used to counter the detachment of the peasant revolutionary Zapata and Villa. 7,000 Mexican city workers went to Constitutionalist Military Training Center, and their participation was a significant victory over Villa Zapata. The Casa justified this on the ground that the religiosity and the primarily agrarian outlook of the Zapatistas and Villistas, accusing them of being baked by the church and bankers. In exchange, Carranza gave the Casa some of the fees of allowed to publication of the paper. Eulogies to heroic constitutional leaders started to appear in these papers with such comment as the triumph of the constitutionalism is the triumph of liberty. All this did not stop Carranza shutting down the Casa HQ 1 year later, when Casa attempted to start organizing again in the workplace. This apparent mistake was argued against by the Mangonista and by the IWW in the United States. It was rejected by the rail workers, the oil workers, and the textile workers of Puebla and Veracruz. An attempt to make set up the Revolutionary Centro Anarcho-Syndicalist Union in July 1915, and a little later, workers' conference took place in Veracruz, and the CNT, the Mexican region, was created. However, this organization was still born after the Antietam general strike in August 1916. It was severely repressed by the Obrero regime. This now set up an official union central to Regional Confederation of Mexico. This new organization was completely corporatist, tightly aligned with the state, with a well-paid and large bureaucracy, acting as a direct control by the politicians over the workers. Even the large number of old activists active within the Mexican anarcho-syndicalist enterprise in its ranks. And to give you an example, while the Baja Revolution started anarchist revolution before being heavily suppressed, there was another one in Morelos. From 1913 to 1917, the peasants of Morelos, led by Mango and Zapata, established an alternative political economic system. There were three fundamental characteristics of what Adolfo Gili calls the Morelos commune, evoking an analogy with the Paris commune in 1871. 1. The naturalization and radical land distribution. 2. The development structure of popular democracy and popular power. And 3. The military defense of the alternative system by the armed people. The Zapatista revolution appropriated without compensation the large hacienda and sugar mills of the state of Morelos. Agrarian conventions handed over all the land to the village, nationalized the sugar mills, and effectively eliminated the capitalist and landowning class. All the capitalists and big landowners leaving the state fled abroad or to the capital. The nationalized sugar mills were managed by workers, provided the industry could go on functioning perfectly well without the bosses. This was tendency among the peasants when they had acquired the land to cultivate subsidy crops for their own consumption and for sale in the local market. But Zapata believed the peasant also should produce sugar for export in order to generate income necessary for economic development. Measures designed to encourage sugar production were adopted, but they had only limited success. In villages under Zapata's control, structural self-government were established. The men in village were met each month for discuss and decide the issues they consider important when they elected delegates who serve at the municipal assemblies, which in turn elected delegates to represent them at the district level. Alongside this structure of village self-government, the village formed associations to create primary school for children and night school for adults, and function as committee for address everyday problems. With reference to the popular association, Gila writes, as the village associate gained experience, we assumed many tasks to read and explain decoration for the revolutionary headquarters, to settle disputes between the villagers, and to arrange talks by the revolutionary lectures. In short, it operated as a true peasant community for all political matters and everyday problems of peasant life. The structure of the village self-government and popular association of the Morelos commune are more participatory, more truly representative than the bourgeois structure of representative democracy, with limited popular participation to biannual election, which voters choose from among candidates with whom they had not had opportunity for interchange in villages, municipal or district assemblies. The structure of popular democracy in Morelos was similar to the Soviets of the Russian Revolution, Revolution, and even more to the Paris Commune. This is also similar to the structure of popular power that would later be developed in Cuba after the triumph of the revolution in 1959, although Cuban popular power and party democracy would be characterized by full and equal participation of women. As we observe the revolution process in the world, we see that revolutions that are also sustain themselves and are characterized by the development of some structure of popular armed self-defense. This occurred in Morelos. The federal army was expelled at least for a period of time, and the function of protecting village and peasant land and defending the rights of citizens was assumed by the Southern Liberation Army of Zapata, an army led by the consistent of the peasants. The Morelos commune was a regional alternative to the official revolutionary government of Carranzas in Mexico City. Once Villa army in the north was eliminated as a serious threat, Carranza government undertook the reconquest of Morelos. In May and June of 1916, the federal army occupied the major city of the state, killing hundreds of people, including combatants and civilians, including women, children, and the elderly. However, Zapata's army organized into small guerrillas, 100 or 200, with his base of the local population, was able to control the countryside. But in late 1918, in the wake of an influenza virus that killed thousands of federal army of people, both sides, the army launched a new offensive and occupied the main towns, forcing the Zapata army to retreat to the mountains. This situation provoked a facilitation, confusion, and contradiction within the Zapata's leadership. Emilio Zapata was assassinated on April 10, 1919, putting to an end of the Anarchist revolution in Baja California and Morelos, ending the Great Revolution of Mexico. And we didn't see something like this till 1994 in Chiapas.